Welcome to the Alex Salmond Show from Scotland, where we look at the future of America. Last year, anthropologist Professor Wade Davis caused a sensation in Rolling Stone magazine when he predicted the fall of America, seeing within the Trump presidency symptoms of a much deeper malaise. In today's show, I return to Wade Davis and ask him whether President Biden and Vice President Harris can stem the tide of history. But first it is Mina with your tweets, your emails and your messages.
Thank you very much indeed, Alex. Well, we've had a tremendous response to our show last week on vaccines, the virus and public health, with over 600,000 views on Facebook. Now, our show featured Professor Luke O'Neill and Professor Sir Harry Burns, and there were so many messages in response to their interviews it was really hard to choose, but here are just a few. Neil Robertson says, "This is great. Very clear, useful and informative explanation of vaccine issues from Dublin, followed by the very reassuring Harry Burns." Neil goes on to say, "And interesting questions too from the interviewer." Felix says, "Great interview. Exactly the information we need just now. Luke O'Neill interview was great also." Mo says, "I would trust Harry Burns with my life. He's a man of great integrity. When you meet him, you recognise sincerity and truth." Mary Higgins makes a really important point when she said, "There's a need for masks at work, but accommodate deaf people who lip read." Then your messages moved on to vaccines and whether any are being disposed of at the end of working days. And Broti Boy says, "My daughter's boyfriend is a GP in Edinburgh and yesterday gave 4 unused doses to end-of-day patients." LW says, "This is exactly what's happening to unused doses where my husband works. Given to staff or patients, even have a list of people who might be able to come in at very short notice as appropriate at the end of the day, with the aim that no doses should go in the bin." Well, that's great news for us all. Now over to Alex, who's interviewing renowned anthropologist Wade Davis.
Wade Davis, welcome back to the Alex Salmond Show.
Thanks very much, Alex. I'm delighted to be here with you.
Wade, can we revisit that article which caused such a sensation last year in the Rolling Stone, where you postulated within the Trump presidency the end of the American era? Now, Trump's gone, Biden's in, a new president. Have you revised your opinions?
Well, yes and no, Alex. Part of that article was simply looking at COVID through the cultural lens and looking at the response of America to the crisis and what that response told us about the sort of the status of American democracy, if you will. And what I portrayed was a country of extreme individualism, suspicion of institutions, and basically a country that really failed miserably to the extent that it almost appeared to its citizenry as a failed state, as these rates of mortality and morbidity soared. So in that sense, I think the argument stands. On the other hand, I sort of presented in that article a kind of a sense that this COVID crisis was anomalous, that it was a particular fulcrum of history, that this really was sort of the moment where the hinge of history opened to the Asian century in America, whether it knew it or not, was in a sort of process of decline. What I've come to realize in my subsequent research is that, in a way, this sort of dark side of America has persisted from the very inception of the country, to the extent that it's impossible truly to understand the events post-COVID, the events of last summer with Black Lives Matter, without understanding the fundamental disturbing truth that race is the story of America. And it's been that way from inception.
But where's the two polarised versions of America also illustrated in the Black Lives Matter protests on the one hand and the Trumpian protest march on Capitol Hill at the beginning of January? Don't these two visions show the polarisation of the country?
Well, absolutely. And I think that's the biggest concern. I mean, if we look at President Biden, it's really interesting, Alex, when the inaugural happened, and I was watching my wife, whose father, as I've mentioned, was almost U.S. president. She's a true American, if you will, grew up on the campaign trail in Illinois, and she was weeping with relief to hear Biden's inaugural address. And I found myself, who is, I'm more prone to easy weeping than Winston Churchill was. I found myself for the first time somewhat callous as I heard the American speeches on the inaugural day, once again invoking this kind of sort of reflexive calling for exceptionalism. And for once in my life, I guess I was suspect of its possibilities. You know, Biden faces just extraordinary challenges. The economy, as you well know, has been utterly artificially propped up by these massive infusions of money from the government. We have no idea how the economy structurally is going to shake out, from everything from restaurants to movie theaters to the airline industry when this pandemic settles down. We have the unresolved issue of social media and the power of these internet corporations who have siloed our opinions, isolated our communities, and created the foundations to only accentuate the polarity, the schism between the two halves of the American reality. And here's the critical thing. You know, it's fascinating, Alex, when commentators reported on the events of January 6th, in typical fashion, they got overheated and they used words like, you know, overthrow, coup d'etat. I mean, if this was coup d'etat, this was a coup by selfie. It was a coup by iPhone. I mean, this was just, it reminded me more of a kind of a raucous crowd at a rock and roll concert, trying to, you know, with the Capitol Police, trying to placate the mob as they moved in a frenzy toward the stage. I mean, I don't mean to underestimate the agonies of that day, the 5 innocent people who were killed, but the most striking thing about that event, to my mind, wasn't the actual violation of the citadel of American democracy. It was 2 things. It was, first of all, that the Confederate flag flew in the halls of Congress for the first time in the history of the United States, something that Stonewall Jackson, Robert E. Lee, James Longstreet, and Jeb Stuart, in 4 brutal years of Civil War, were never able to manage. The second thing was the reaction of the government, including the Capitol Police, to that mob. Again, they seem to me to be more like security guards at a rock and roll concert, in some cases posing for selfies with the invaders of the Temple of Democracy. Imagine for a second, Alex, if that crowd had been those in favor of Black Lives Matter. Can you imagine if, you know, thousands of African Americans had stormed Congress, or Latinos, or whatever? I think they would have been shot down. So again, you saw on display this strange bifurcation of the American reality. That was a crowd that was about only one thing: white supremacy. And this is what we're seeing in the reaction. This is an America that is divided not just politically, it's divided urban, rural, and demographically. The bottom line is America is becoming no longer a white society. And those who are threatened by that are the ones who are reacting in this way. The one fantastic thing we have in Joe Biden at last is a good man, a decent man, a kind man, a wounded man, a man who can reach out to everybody. He is as honest as a day is long and as decent as the innocence of birth. But his challenge is enormous.
And isn't succeeding President Trump both an advantage and a disadvantage for Joe Biden? On the one hand, President Biden can make the news merely by unsigning all the executive orders that President Trump put into place. On the other hand, that doesn't in itself tackle the underlying questions in American society that you've just spoken about.
No, you're absolutely right, Alex. I mean, one of the things that was so fascinating, and I herald President Biden for his executive orders. I mean, almost every one of these was reversing some egregious and completely self-indulgent gesture of Donald Trump, whether it was, leaving the World Health Organization, stepping out of the Paris Accord. I mean, Biden has mercifully use the executive privilege to staunch these incredible wounds in America's international reputation. Even the Republican Party thought that the American people, even the 75 million who had voted for Donald Trump, would not tolerate Confederate flags in the Capitol, would not tolerate Capitol Police being beaten, would not tolerate the desecration of that institution, thugs and sitting in the chair of the Speaker in the House and so on. The threatened violence to members of Congress from both parties. And so that's why you suddenly saw people like McConnell having a turn of heart at the last moment and condemning or at least denying the legitimacy of that crowd, even though, don't forget, that on the actual night of that incident, only 10 Republicans turned against their vote. The vast majority continued to pursue this spurious suggestion that the election had been rigged, by all accounts, an utter fabrication. But the bottom line is the Republican Party, even on the day of the incident, still decided to vote on the spurious accusation of fraud in those elections. And what have we seen since that day? I think people like McConnell really thought that even the Trump or some percentage of the Trump cohort would turn on the president. But when that did not happen, what do we see? We see the Republican House and Senate backtracking as fast as they can. We see members of the Congress flying down to Florida, to Mar-a-Lago, to pay their respects and homage to the fallen president. You're seeing the Republican Party turn all of its lenses onto 2022 and the chance to reverse the razor lead that the Democrats have now in the Senate and in the Congress. And so you don't see any indication whatsoever that the Republican Party, as presently constituted, has any intention whatsoever of moderating its rhetoric, seeking consilience, or even reaching across the aisle in the slightest way.
Join us after the break when Alex continues his discussion with Wade Davis. We'll see you then. Welcome back. Alex is in conversation with anthropologist Wade Davis on whether a Biden presidency can arrest an American decline.
But moving on back to the question of the end of the American era, in your estimation, can President Biden, in your words, a good man, can he arrest the decline, or is he like a good emperor in ancient Rome? He can have a period of tranquility, but the empire will still decline and fall.
Well, I think the most important thing is that Donald Trump be taken out of the equation. And I think the mistake the Democrats made, Alex, is calling for a second impeachment. What they should have done, and what some people were suggesting that they do, was invoke the 14th Amendment, which would have solved the problem. The 14th Amendment was brought in, Alex, in the immediate wake of the U.S. Civil War in order to prevent the leadership of the South from suddenly just slipping back into politics. After all, Jefferson Davis, who was the president of the Confederacy, had been a well-known and powerful senator from Mississippi before the Civil War. So the 14th Amendment was designed to keep that leadership from simply slipping back into the Congress. And it said explicitly that any American who is held, proven to have promoted sedition in any way, is not eligible to run for public office. Well, the cameras recorded Trump's gesture on that morning, that if that wasn't an invitation to the mob to storm the Congress, I don't know what it was. So I think the 14th Amendment, which critically does not require a 2/3 majority, but a simple majority to convict someone of violating that amendment, the Democrats could have invoked that and simply taken Trump out of the equation as a potential candidate in 2024. Now, I question whether or not Trump will run in 2024. There are no second acts in American politics, but on the other hand, or in American life, but on the other hand, Trump has defied all conventional thinking since he ran for office in 2015. There has also been a fledgling effort to begin a new party that will attract the conservative right and right of center that will no longer be a Republican Party. So the really interesting question is whether people on the right of the American political spectrum are prepared to see that cohort of which they're members divided in such a way that they will assure Democrats control of both the Congress and the presidency for the indefinite future. If the right wing splits dramatically like that, it's hard to imagine how the Democrats won't have a run that they haven't seen since Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
Can I turn now, Wade Davis, to an article you wrote last week for the Scientific American, where you argued it was an apology for anthropology. You argued the role of anthropologists in allowing people to understand the huge changes in society and society attitudes that are being compressed into the last generation, attitudes to equality, to race, to gender. But isn't the divisions that we've spoken about between the Trumpian supporters and the rest of America, isn't that a sign that not everybody is signed up to that transformation?
Oh, you're absolutely correct. I mean, that, Alex, that is the crisis. I'm glad you brought up that article, because everything up until now has just been, my expertise. I'm an anthropologist, and I feel like I've been acting like a political pundit. And I think sometimes all the pundits do is read the newspapers and regurgitate it on TV shows like this. So, I look, what I was writing in the piece in Scientific American, it was just to sort of remind people of something. If Alex, if you think of the life of your great grandfather, or in your case or my case, our grandparents, look at what they believed about race, about the role of women, about the attitudes towards the environment. We today would not embrace or endorse one of their moral certitudes, which are as distant from our lives as the ideas of 19th century clergymen who believed that the earth was but 6,000 years old. We live in a whole different world. And so, but my point is that if you actually think it's normal for an Irish boy to have an Asian girlfriend, or a Jewish friend to find solace in the Buddhist Dharma, or if you think that a single mother can be a good mother, that two women or two men can be good parents as long as there's love in the house, if you believe all of these things, you are a child of anthropology. In other words, social movements don't just come out of nowhere. New ideas have to be their catalysts. And so it begs a question: how is it that the world in which we live would be as unrecognizable to our grandparents as their world and values are morally reprehensible from our perspective? Simply wrong. What is it, in other words, that allowed women in a generation or two to go from the kitchen to the boardroom, people of color from the woodshed to the White House, gay people from the closet to the altar? These movements were political movements, but there had to be something that challenged them. And what that challenge was the visionary insights of a small group of contrarians who gathered around a legendary figure in American history, Franz Boas, the father of American cultural anthropology, and a man who deserves to rank with Darwin, Einstein, and Freud as the four pillars of modern thought. And his insights, part of what he was saying is, manners don't make the man, men and women invent the manners. Race is a total fiction. And he wouldn't live to see his ideas or his intuitions about cultural relativism become both accepted and proven by hard science, but also become the zeitgeist of a whole new era. But the truth of the matter is, we all live in a social reality first forged in the dreams of these individuals. And for their beliefs in the 1920s and 30s, they were hounded by the FBI, denied academic tenure, ridiculed for what they believed, and punished for being the subversive that they truly were. And yet they gave us the modern world as we know it. Boas said there's no point to anthropology if it's not in the service of a greater tolerance and understanding. And the incredible thing is that their ideas, which were intuitions, have been confirmed by hard science. In my lifetime, geneticists, for example, Alex, have shown that the genetic endowment of humanity is a continuum. Race really is a fiction. We are all cut from the same genetic cloth. We're all descendants of the same common ancestors, including those who walked out of Africa 65,000 years ago, and then in 2,500 human generations, the span of 40,000 years, carried the human spirit to every corner of the habitable world. But here's the important idea. If we're cut from the same genetic cloth, which we are, then every society shares the same genius. And whether that genius is expressed through technological wizardry, the great achievement of the West, or, for example, unraveling the complex threads of memory inherent in a myth, is simply a matter of choice and cultural orientation. There is no hierarchy of culture.
And finally, Professor Davis, isn't there a hopeful argument to be made about America? America was riven by slavery, but Abraham Lincoln won the Civil War. America was run at the end of the 19th century by industrial combines, but a succession of presidents pursued antitrust laws. America was fraught with isolationism in the 1930s, but Franklin D. Roosevelt took America and, along with might and Russian blood, saved the world from darkness. So isn't there a hopeful aspect within President Biden and Vice President Harris that combination may be exactly what America needs in this moment of crisis?
Alex, you're absolutely right. I mean, you know, when I wrote that original Rolling Stone piece that brought us together, I didn't forecast the decline of America with any kind of glee. On the contrary, you know, if the world opens to the Asian century, dominated by the current regime in Beijing, for example, with their treatment of ethnic minorities, their disregard for freedom of the press, freedom of expression, democracy itself, we will all be longing for the American century. And yes, it's true that America has always been the best of all things and the worst of all things. This is what makes it so charismatic. You know, this is why people like Oscar Wilde said it's the only country to go through birth to decadence without passing through civilization. He quipped like that because it was so crazy, this place called America. De Tocqueville said the same thing. He said, this is a place that's so obsessed with the individual that it becomes on the edge of a kind of a pathology. And yet at the same time, America has thrived. You know, it has been the land of Donald Trump, but it was the land of Lincoln. You know, if Lincoln called for charity for all, malice toward none, we unfortunately have had a president who called for malice towards all and charity for none. But we can reverse that. We can become the country of Walt Whitman and the Grateful Dead and Abraham Lincoln again. But we should always remember that in this ebb and flow of American zeal, you know, from the heights of victory in 1945, when the country really had, as you suggest, become the arsenal of democracy, you know, fueling not only Allied armies, but also the Russian assault on Hitler's fortress Europe. It also, within years of that and fighting the Cold War, indulged this rat of a man called Joseph McCarthy. Yes, Abraham Lincoln won the Civil War, but in many ways the South won the peace with the violation of Reconstruction and the institution of the Jim Crow laws in the wake of a series of Supreme Court decisions calling for separate but equal when nothing was equal and everything was separate for over 70 years. So one only hopes that as Lincoln famously invoked, that America would reach for the better angels of our nature. And he said that even as the South, led by South Carolina, seceded from the Union, and as he remarked on that cold day in Washington, speaking obviously without amplification to this vast crowd assembled before him, he had no idea that as he called for Americans to turn to the better angels of their nature, before they would have a chance to do that, they would endure a bloody civil war for over 4 years that would create rivers of carnage in every corner of the American nation.
Professor Davis, Wade Davis, thank you so much for joining me once again on the Alex Salmond Show.
Many thanks, Alex.
A week is a long time in politics, but anthropologist Wade Davis, he deals in centuries. There is little doubt that the unchallenged supremacy as the world's only superpower of America, which has been in being since 1990, that era is coming to an end. A return to rationality in the White House is welcome, but it's difficult to see how it can arrest that trend. And the underlying divisions in American society, thrown into sharp relief by the Trump presidency, are not going to go away anytime soon. But history teaches us there are different ways and rates of decline. The Western Roman Empire reached its zenith in the 2nd century, but it didn't fall for another 300 years. Similarly, America may be on the relative decline compared with Asia, but it will still remain a dominant social, cultural and economic influence for generations to come. And so for myself, Tasmina, and all at the show, it's goodbye for now, stay safe, and we'll see you again next week.